Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. I'm Karuna from Zuban and I'd like to welcome you all to the final session of Performance as Resistance in Digital Spaces. Just a few introductions before we start today's session. Zuban is a feminist publishing house and NGO that chronicles and participates in women's movements in India and South Asia. We are conducting this webinar as part of Zuban's Stepping Stones and Body of Evidence projects. Stepping Stones, supported by IDRC and implemented jointly by Zuban in India and Panos South Asia in Nepal, and Body of Evidence, supported by the Gathi Institute Max Muller Bhavan, build on Zuban and IDRC Sexual Violence and Impunity project and aim to take its work further through creative forms like art, poetry, and theatre. Together, we explore what exactly impunity is, how it plays out in various systems, and how we uphold it in our everyday lives. You can find out more about this project via the link in our chat box. Under these projects, we've collaborated with 27 artists, poets, theatre activists, and collectives across India and Nepal to create performances, engage in dialogues, and produce artwork to initiate important and often uncomfortable conversations about sexual violence and impunity. This has also resulted in the creation of a collective feminist project called the Alphabet of Violence and Resistance in India and Nepal. Illustrated by artists across India and Nepal, it focuses on impunity through various lenses and the lived realities of Dalit, queer, Northeastern, Kashmiri artists, etc. This series hopes to continue these conversations in the time to come. You can view both sets of alphabets via the link in our chat box. Performance as Resistance in Digital Spaces is thus a series of discussions in two parts, centered around the effect the pandemic has had on the field of performing arts and the potential of virtual spaces in creating platforms to talk about existing, new, and rising forms of sexual violence and impunity, but also the various challenges that emerge from using these spaces. Today's session will touch upon collective solidarity and the elusiveness of justice, bringing to the fore the experiences of performing artists in created work that is centered around these subjects, and what kind of strengths, vulnerabilities, and discussions emerge as a result. Taking place on the eve of what is celebrated as Independence Day in India, and on the day correspondingly celebrated as the birth of the nation in Pakistan, this session will also aim to trace the sexual violence that preceded and followed the declaration of this independence, and how justice has eluded survivors for decades. It situates that discourse in today's context, where collectivities and solidarities have been built over generations, with new ones emerging rapidly, wherein various mediums are being used to discuss and examine these injustices and also the impunity that the state and its various structures enjoy. I would now like to introduce our speakers for today. Mallika Taneja is a theatre artist living and working in New Delhi. Shabari Rao is an independent artist, educator, and researcher based in Bangalore. Her work is rooted in practice-based research, which focuses on the relationship between body, performance, and learning. Urvashi Butalia co-founded Kali for Women in 1984 and Zuban in 2003. She has over 35 years of experience in feminist and independent publishing and has a long involvement in the women's movement in India. She will also be moderating today's discussion. Before we begin, I'd briefly like to go over the rules for the participants who are here today. Thank you all for joining us. Your video and audio have been turned off on entry, and please do keep them turned off. Audience questions will be taken via the chat box, which we will close once we get a certain number of questions that can be answered today. However, the raise hand function will be available to direct any queries to the host, that is me, and others who have Zuban in their names. So please feel free to use that feature. We will start dealing with the questions at around 4:45 p.m. If there's any speaker in particular you'd like to direct your questions to, please make sure you mention that as well. This discussion will be recorded and posted online via our social media channels. Entry has been strictly moderated to guard against trolling. No hate speech, targeting, or discriminating against any community will be tolerated, and participants found using such language will be removed from the webinar immediately without warning. If you'd like to quote the speakers outside of this webinar, please contact us before you do so. That's all for now, and over to Urvashi.
Thank you, Karuna. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion. Thank you all for giving the lie to the now widely held belief that there is webinar fatigue and nobody wants to come onto the net and listen to or talk to people. But we're glad to see so many of you here. So Karuna has actually laid out the ground really well. Let me just give you a little bit of historical perspective before we launch into the discussion. As Karuna said, today, the 14th of August, 2020, in a sense, it marks the closure of several sets of activities that Zuban has been engaged in for many years on the question of sexual violence and the lack of accountability that there is for the perpetrators of sexual violence in every way, socially, legally, economically, and in many other ways. But as everything, it is a moment of closure for two projects that Zuban has been running, but also a moment where we hope new ideas will come up and some of the learnings of these two projects will be taken into the future in new and different ways. I'd like to give you a little bit of background on the project. We began thinking about looking at the reasons for the impunity of perpetrators in sexual violence incidents across South Asia in about, I think it was September or October 2012. We felt that increasingly we saw incidents, particularly of mass violence, public violence, and yet there was a deafening silence and no accountability. And how was this phenomenon happening across South Asia? So we began a research study which was aimed at breaking the silence, at questioning notions of justice, at creating social engagement, at talking to people, at taking the issue out into the public sphere. Within a few months of our beginning, the gang rape of Jyoti Singh Pandey happened in Delhi. And suddenly this unspeakable silenced issue was out in the public domain and people were talking about it. And that made us realize how important and urgent this enterprise of doing the research we were doing was. It is very unfortunate that it had to be the death and violation of a young woman that pushes this issue out into the public sphere, but it did begin to raise a number of discussions. In looking at the issue of sexual violence, we see ourselves as continuing a long tradition that begins, as Karuna mentioned, at independence, when the question of the mass sexual violation of women is something that everybody knows about, but nobody really talks out aloud. And from that moment to the later moment of the mid and late 70s and early 80s, where the activists in the nascent and the new women's movement take up sexual violence as a major issue and start to organize about it and bring into being the first ever changes in the law on rape post the colonial rulers, to today, when it is something that is confidently and loudly and politically being articulated by many women, some who are speaking out, many who are reporting cases because they feel empowered to report it. And yet there continues to be a certain kind of silence and a lack of discussion. But there has been a long and important trajectory. And what's important is that it has been led by and large by activists within the different women's movements in this country. The state has remained indifferent, misogynistic. The institutions of the state have likewise remained like that. So that it's very clear to us that there is a long battle. And it is this that also made us think inside Zuban how we could take the findings of the first study that we conducted, which began, as I said, in September, October 2012, and which covered 5 countries of South Asia, looking at sexual violence and impunity in those countries. So these were a set of research studies that resulted in 8 books, but were based on extensive research and interviews. And we found that the findings of those, very significant, would stay inside the covers of those academic books or inside the rooms of academia, unless we thought of ways of taking them out. So the project that followed, called Body of Evidence and Stepping Stones, two sister projects, enabled us to work with artists, with poets, with theater persons, to take the findings of what we call the SVI project out into the public sphere through different media, including the medium of theater. So today we have with us two women who work in theater, who worked with us through this project, who took the productions that they created far and wide alongside others who did the same, and whose work, like that of many other people who were involved in this project, came to a sudden halt with the lockdown and then was forced to move into the digital sphere. So we'll be talking to them really about their work, about the kind of engagements that they created with the public by performing what must have been very difficult pieces of theater, because they were also very personal, they were also very political, and they also make the protagonists, the actors, the directors, the people who put them together extremely vulnerable. We will be talking to the two of them about their practice and their experience of talking in public about this very important issue. I'd like to start with asking Shabari. Shabari, if you could tell us a little bit about the production you put together and what it was like for you to raise discussions about this issue, about the issue of sexual violence in the public domain. What were the challenges? What were the opportunities of the work that you did?
Thanks, Urvashi. Thank you all for being here. It's been quite a journey, and to think that this is a culminating event is, in a way, a little bit sad. But as you also say, hopefully other things will emerge from here. So I made a piece that responded to the work of Zuban's research. I chose to make a character who I think is very different from me. So I chose to play a police officer from Delhi, in fact, and to see whether I could look at how the system from inside works. Like how does a female police officer negotiate the power that she has, as well as her own ideas about gender and so on. So what kind of feminist is she? Is she really a feminist? I wanted to work with material that wasn't from a personal space or a personal narrative. I wanted to work with something that was quite far away from me and investigate this whole issue from almost from the other side. So I built this character called Lakshmi Nagapa, and she's an IPS officer from Delhi, and the performance is structured as a talk. So she's giving this talk. One of the things that I found that was really interesting in the way it was received is that people, when they watch the show, they're not quite sure whether Lakshmi Nagapa is for real or not. So many times people are quite confused whether there really exists somebody called Lakshmi Nagapa and she's really an IPS officer from Delhi, or is this Shabari playing a character? Because when just before I come onto the stage, whoever's been announcing or introducing the other pieces of theater introduces me as Lakshmi Nagapa, and then I come on and I start the talk. And this element of confusion, I think, really serves an interesting purpose, because it really unsettles audiences, it unsettles opinions, even people who are very liberal and left politically. They're not quite able to get a hold of this character. They're not quite able to understand where she stands, because she's a very gray, very kind of murky character who you never quite know what her politics are. You never quite know how she's going to swing, but she's intelligent, she's powerful, she knows the right words, and yet it's not very clear whether she's a good cop or a bad cop, and how can the Delhi police be a good cop anyway? But that's a different, that's something else. In terms of vulnerability, I think I was always a little bit scared to perform it, particularly when I was in Delhi. It was the height of the kind of anti-CAA and NRC protests, and the Delhi police had a really rubbish reputation at that point. And to stand up there claiming to be somebody from the Delhi police was a bit nerve-wracking. And I think the issue is that the kind of the directorial voice and the voice of the character are not actually aligned. My worry was that people would think that me, Shabari, holds those opinions. And to me, it was very important to kind of have this character be really complex and confusing and not quite solid in terms of her ethics and her, her choices, her politics. But me as the director, I didn't want that confused with me. So the directorial voice and the voice of the character needed to be very clearly separated. And because they weren't aligned, it was very important for me to get the tone right. But in the end, I think I also open up the performance, because it's a talk, I open it up for questions as Lakshmi Nagapa. So very often the audience asks me questions as the police officer, and then I have to kind of improvise from there. So that's a bit of a vulnerable moment as well, because I'm never quite sure how strongly people feel about the Delhi police. But I have to say that all in all, it's always turned out okay. Nothing seriously scary has happened. And I think it always kind of makes people unsettled and a bit confused about what's going on. And I think that's a good thing.
Shabari, where did you, what are the different locations to which you took this production, and what were the kinds of reactions you got from there?
So part of the mandate, of course, was to perform at colleges. So I performed at a medical college, I performed at a law college, also a media college. So the college responses were very interesting. A lot of conversation about, particularly at NLS, that is the National Law School here in Bangalore, about, because it's a police officer and she's kind of talking about, these kind of slippery loopholes in the law. There was a lot of really interesting debate around, how the legal system is complicit, how the legal system can, and as law students, what is their responsibility, what is their kind of job at this point. Similarly, in the other two colleges as well, there was a lot of debate and conversation around representation of women in the media and so on, and women as professional and what they need to do to what kind of compromises they need to make. So there was a lot of interesting conversations. I also performed for the Zuban showcase in Delhi. I think we didn't have an audience interaction per se at that point, but because my piece opens up a conversation within the piece, we did have like quite a few people actually wanting to ask Lakshmi Nagapa questions. And that was really interesting to see that people, despite at some point I kind of get on the table and stuff in the performance. So I always assume that at that point people realize that it's a performance and that I'm not actually a police officer. But but when it comes to the questions, people do ask as if I was Lakshmi Nagapa, which is which is interesting. I also performed here in Bangalore to a kind of twice, I think, to open audiences, and there have been really interesting conversations about. Yeah, I think the elusiveness of the law is a very apt phrase, and the responsibility of people in power who would be like, you know, senior police officers, and how do they negotiate, how do they navigate, um, the power that they have, as well as their politics, as well as personal kind of pulls and priorities. So a lot of the conversation was around that.
Okay, Shabari, let me come back to you. I want to pull in Mallika at this point. Mallika, your production was very different and also was very premised on involving a young audience in responding or in taking decisions on what was within quotes right or wrong, or how to think about things like consent, how to think. Can you talk a little bit about that, and what were some of the reactions you got?
Again, like Shabari, it's been a very long journey, and for me, the journey of my piece allegedly continues, because right now it's in the process of redoing itself into a format that can start traveling to different locations. And our first, when the first set of material came to me, and when we started researching and started talking to all the people at Zuban also, acha, what can happen, etc., the first realization that dawned upon me is the fact that I really don't know the law. And if I have to make a piece that is speaking about justice and impunity and speaking about sexual violence and law, I have to engage with the question of the law. I have to know the law. And then began a 6-month-long journey, and a continuing journey for now also, of really understanding the law. And it is so dense, it is so inaccessible for a lay person that we really started feeling how to enter this question of justice and legality when we actually don't understand the law, and whatever we understand is kind of half-baked. At the same time, I was thinking very much about the audiences that we are going to find ourselves in front of, the demographic of the audience, the social location of the audience, and our own social location. Now, it was very clear that at least in the beginning of our shows, we are going to be speaking to, let's say, for the lack of a better way to say it, people who have a similar life experience like mine. And here I'm speaking more in terms of class and language than specifics of life. And then one thought, okay, then what is the conversation you want to really stir? And I always feel like the theater is interesting to me because I feel, oh, you know, you have 1 hour or 1 hour, 15 minutes or something like that, and there's a room full of people who's willing to listen to you. Now, what do you say to them? And you probably will never have these people again in your life, the same set of people. Probably many of them never ever again. So you have this one chance to say something. So what do you say and how do you say it? And this is also like all that's gone on in trying to figure how to place the audience. So for that reason, the proscenium, I feel I have rejected entirely, because I don't find that format interesting anymore, of audiences to be in the dark and us to be on a raised platform. The one-sided communication has stopped interesting me. I feel more and more the theater is a moment of its temporary communities, and in those temporary communities, some shifting, pushing, pulling should happen in that very particular moment. And therefore I thought that, okay, let's us be on the left and the right, and let the audience never hear the entire story in front together. Let them forever need to look left or right to listen to who they do. They shouldn't be able to see somebody and listen. I mean, the choice is always you see somebody and listen to the other, or you listen to this person, but it never is a composite picture. And strangely enough, when we started talking about consent and we started making this piece and all, we also in India went through our big Me Too moment. And that also really sprung making of the piece it really pushed it in very many directions. Because then we started thinking about law. Is this enough? What sort of a conversation do we need? What is due process? What do we want? How do we feel? And it kind of started getting pulled in so many directions that we ourselves wanted to put in all these things. So it started from really trying to unpack the law, and it went on to unpacking process of navigating the law. Then slowly it moved towards moving away from process, still quoting law, because I felt like quoting, like putting the sections, putting the name of the offenses was very, very important. And of course, then we have questions on that. Do you know what this is? Do you know what that is? And really kind of have a gray conversation with extremely black and white options. So we chose the color scheme of the piece also to be very black and white. The design of it was left and right. The words were in black and white. The choices people had to say what they said was yes and no. And we purposely didn't give a maybe to really push the discomfort or the lack of no or the need to think on your feet at the moment, and also put you in the position of needing to judge now, decide now. And one was feeling like this is also extremely unfortunate and unfair how this entire discussion about sexual violence, justice and all had started happening. It's right, there and then people make up their mind, and also to kind of open that up and say, it's not that easy. It's not right and wrong. It's not left or right. It's not yes or no. It's simply not that easy. And if you just go out of the theater knowing this, that's enough.
So,
Have
Mallika,
I answered my question?
sorry?
Have I answered the question?
You've raised many more questions, and some of them I was noting down to come back to you about, but you've already spoken about them. So, but nevertheless, I'm going to come back to you and Shabari on a couple of questions that were in what you said. One of them was you mentioned justice and legality, and you talked about how you can know those without understanding the law. And it's a question that I wanted both of you to reflect on, because one of the key things we're talking about in the discussion on sexual violence is what is justice? And what does justice mean? And how does justice look for the survivor or the victim? And for people who are close to her. So is it necessarily linked to the law is my question to you. The other thing that you have mentioned, and this links with, both of you were performing at a time, and Shabari for some of the time, and you for a lot of the time, when the anti-CAA protests were going on. So in a sense, the political mahal in which you were performing was very linked to questions of justice, if not necessarily around sexual violence, but at least around citizenship, which is also linked to questions of sexual violence and sexuality and sexual identities and so on. And both of you have in some senses chosen to move away from proscenium, but not quite move into street, but create something of your own which occupies a space somewhere in between. So I have questions about all of this, but I want you to first just address the issue of justice. How does it look? How easy or difficult is it to engage people on questions of justice and beyond mere legality through theatre? Mallika, you first.
I think in the process of making the piece, and I think it's also really got catapulted by the Me Too moment and everything that happened after. And also we are sitting 2 years on. Like I'm also sitting on 2.5 years of engaging with this conversation in many different ways, in which my other piece has also gone on, and I've made something else also, and the CA movement has happened, in which also we made something. It's interesting to talk about the street because that was a completely different form one picked up there. And I mean, basically, I think the answer is no. Legality is not the only place where we look for justice or that provides justice. But that's not to say that we reject it, because there is a large section of women in this country, and I think world over, who need the legal thappa to say you have been wronged. Without that, people don't believe that they have been violated. When we live in a country that refuses to register FIRs, when you go and say sexual violence, they say you must have asked for it, it must have been consensual. You require the state, that big daddy, to say no, you actually have been wrong, and this is the punishment for this. That some places the framework of justice is only one, because there is not the option of social justice or whatever else kind of justice, emotional justice, that you really draw all your social, emotional, legal, economical justice from the courts. And therefore I will never ever reject that, and always sort of like acknowledge the importance of that and the need to keep going back to it for many people. At the same time, my piece, the story that I've picked up, which is from my life, and I chose to choose a story which is really working with a very small nuance and detail, and I chose not to go into a hard case, because I wanted to open the question of what is justice also. I mean, I don't think the piece reached there entirely, but the question of what do you want comes back again and again and again from the interrogator to the interrogatee. And it's a question that both Shenna and I really went back and forth on several times. What do I want? Do you want a sorry? Do you want to make a Facebook post? Do you want him to give you some money? What do you want? And if he does say sorry, or you make a post, or he gives you money, has the justice happened then? So I think it is not a, so I think justice open and shut book. I mean, I would say the same thing about like legal justice. Once the person is put away in jail, do I feel as if justice has happened? Like, where does the justice happen? When I feel it happens, when the court says it happens, when the person thinks he's punished, when does it happen? And I think it's super complicated. I'm moving it in my head right now. I don't have an answer. What I do know is that it's not a single path.
Yeah, it's not.
And sometimes maybe.
Yeah. Okay, let me turn to Shabari. Yeah. I want to bring her in on this. Shabari, what's your view on the issue of justice especially for victims and survivors of sexual violence, and the linking with legality?
So my piece was called Open and Shut, as if these things are like that. It's clear, it's simple, and the legal system itself is, clearly laid out. And if you enter it, then you will, through the due process, you will be kind of spat out at the other end, and everything is kind of clear. And I think both Mallika's and my piece kind of show that the legal system itself can't guarantee justice of any sort, even of the legal sort. So even legal justice within the legal system, if you choose to go the legal system, itself is not, clear cut. That kind of justice is itself not clear cut. And of course, I think because my piece focuses on the legal system, it shows the shortcomings, the limitations, the murkiness of the legal system, and therefore opens up conversations or possibilities about other kinds of justice and other kinds of conversations around impunity or around complicity and so on. I think Mallika said a lot about what counts as justice, when is justice seen to be done, and who needs to feel that. Is it actually there's a line in my performance, is it about the victim or the person who suffered the abuse, or is it about the community, or is it something larger? Like, does a whole community need to feel like, okay, and whether that's a community of women or whether that's any other community, how when do you feel that justice has been served? And I fully agree with Mallika that there is clearly no simple answer to this, and I would actually be interested to hear from you, Urvashi, about your research into what does justice look or feel like, because of your research with these
With the
communities.
partition. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it was a very, very difficult moment for women at that time, because many, as we know, thousands of women were abducted and raped, and there was no question of justice across countries, because there was no accountability, or even less accountability, because you couldn't track down the perpetrators. And actually the entire focus of the Indian state, I don't know what happened with the Pakistani state, was not on the perpetrators, not until 1952 or something, trying to track the perpetrators, because it wasn't difficult to track them because many women knew who they were. The entire focus was on the survivors, but also the ways in which they were treated when women were, within quotes, rescued or recovered from their rapists and brought back, put in transit camps or brought back to their families. Their families had completely refused to accept them in India because they thought the women were polluted, and the women spent their lives in ashrams. And sometimes they fought legal cases to be allowed to stay with the man of the other religion, but the state did not see them as citizens at all. So justice eluded them in many ways, partly because of the way the nation state was made, partly because of the patriarchy inherent in our laws, and partly because the state did not then and does not today consider women as autonomous citizens, able to, with the ability to take their own decisions and say what they want. Which is something that plays out in both your productions, because your police officer, when she is speaking about the victim of the crime, the survivor, is also in a sense articulating it in terms of how the state sees that. But I want to move on to another question, which was at the heart of this discussion. And we're looking to see if there are any questions to ask you. So the thing is that both of you have talked now about the engagement with the community. Mallika, you said, to get a number of people you might never ever see again, and to have them as a captive, in quotes, captive audience for an hour. So you create a momentary community in which you are actually talking. Now, with the lockdown and the disappearance of the physical space and having to transfer whatever you do to the digital space, how easy has that transition, easy or difficult has that transition been? Has it enabled you to create a new community? Have you lost the community? What are the issues that have accompanied this enforced move for you both? Shabari, do you want to go first?
I feel like I can't do the same thing that I used to do in a new format. I think I notice a lot of resistance in myself. I can't find it in me to kind of upload videos or even think about creating kind of virtual performances, etc. And to me, it's not just the performance process that creates the community or creates, where this kind of physical connection is needed. It's even more so in the making of the piece. I feel utterly kind of helpless to actually make something. For me, a lot of my work is collaborative, and I often feel like I can think better when I'm in a studio with people and actually able to move and use my body. And I think a lot in movement and in collaboration with other people. So making of new work just seems like really, I don't know how to do it. And putting up old work that was meant for a kind of a face-to-face audience onto or adapting it for a screen is just, I don't know, simply not terribly appealing. And just to add to that, once the lockdown and so on happened, of course, we're all stuck at home, and I have two children who don't go to school anymore. So there's a lot of other stuff actually that needs my attention and that needs my time. And so I find I don't actually have much time to be an artist anymore. I have to be a parent, and I have to be a partner, and I have to be, take out the garbage and, clean the kitchen and all of this. So, so no new work, not much anyway.
No new theater work, you mean? Plenty of new art.
Yeah, well, I don't know, like, does washing the dishes every day count as new work, or is it just the same old work, but
Not
nothing to show?
new, but it's more of it, right?
That's
Okay,
yeah.
let's hear from Mallika, and then we have a number of questions. So Mallika, 2 minutes, and then I'm going to move on to the questions.
So of course, in a sense, theatre work has stopped entirely, right? Like there's no audience, there's no performance, and I'm not feeling the reading scripts on Zoom kind of thing. I don't think that's the work I do, and I'm not feeling it. So in a sense, performance has stopped entirely, and that's a real big dhakka in a sense, because that was a very big part of my life. Performing, being in front of audiences was a very big part of my life, which has just stopped. At the same time, I'm also making. So it's a weird sort of space to kind of be on the phone and calls all the time to try things, and then this really new, a very big labor in trying to figuring out how to meet, where to meet, when to meet, if it's possible to meet or not. It's just become very, very, very challenging. And one can say that I'm shooting a bit in the dark. There's two other projects that I kind of do, which have had interesting journeys. One is called Sex Chat Room. I think everything, most of the stuff that I do is, I think now, is some or the other attempt at forming some community. Temporary community, but that's what it is. So Sex Chat Room was one such in which it was an all-women space that got together, and we were just talking about sex as a way to, a peer learning space to speak about desire, pleasure, etc. That is a space that found a place online. Now, tomorrow is the third one that we are going to be doing. And it's interesting to see how some of the people who've been in the physical sex chat rooms and the online one flows much better. I wonder if it's because we have a habit to talk online about sex much more than talk face to face. And also it's opened it up in the sense that there are people from different cities, many more age groups that are able to participate. So that's been an interesting shift. The other one that got completely stranded was Women Walk at Midnight. And we had, the team got together and had many discussions, shall we also do a webinar, maybe we'll do an Insta talk and all of that. And none of it worked because the practices of getting together and walking. So when you can't get together and you can't walk and you have curfew and you can't get out, and if you get out, somebody's policing you even more than they were policing you earlier. But then what is walking? What is midnight to care? We haven't seen in I don't know how many days. And with that came the idea that, okay, let's say that we walk individually in our different places, and this entire weekend, 14, 15, 16, thinking about independence, thinking about freedom, thinking about walking. We've sent out a call to say, okay, women walk at midnight in your cities with the women you want on your street at your hour of the night. let's begin to search again what it means to do all this. So I think one is just looking, that's it, searching.
Okay, thanks. So now there are lots of questions. I'm going to try and combine these a little bit. So, Shabari, there's a question for you about the directorial voice and the voice of the character when you said they needed to be separated. So where do you locate your own self in this performance? Or to say, is the performance of the character a reflection of your own self? And if that is the case, then to what extent? And then, Mallika, there is a question for you that actually echoes this, but by a different person. This is a question from Mangai, which says, can you comment on the documentary nature of the stories that you're telling? Where does fact and fiction meet or separate? And how does this create or affect your thoughts on representation? So both are like flip sides of the coin. So whoever wants to go first, but keep your answers a bit short because I've got lots of questions.
Okay, shall I go first?
Yeah.
All right. So the character voice and the directorial voice. So the character is not me. I'm not that person. And yet I feel like I've done a lot of work with the kind of victim survivor side of stories of sexual violence and working with personal narratives and so on. So I wanted to try something kind of radically different, like create this character that was very different from me. I think part of it, where do I locate myself, or how does that, how does the character meet me, the person Shabari? Anyway, that's like a bit complex, but I feel like it's easy for many of us to identify with the victims of sexual violence. And I am kind of interested in looking at what bits of us or what aspects of us identify with the perpetrator or with people who are in power, or in terms of complicity, in terms of impunity as well, or granting impunity as well. And it was interesting for me to notice those aspects in myself, although I consider myself very different from the character that I played. It was important for me also to have the separation, that it wasn't Shabari's opinions that Lakshmi Nagapa was speaking. And I think for my own safety and my own protection, I felt like I needed that separation, especially because there was a lot of talk about police impunity, because a lot of these performances happened around the time of the anti-CAA and NRC protests, and there was a lot of like police impunity was very much something that people were talking about. So in a way, I felt that I needed to create that separation between me as a director and me as and Lakshmi Nagapa as a character.
Which you did. Yeah. Mallika?
Yeah, it's a very, I don't think I can be, I think the first thought that had come to my head when making the piece was that I don't think I can play or I can take on any of the stories of violence that I was reading in the Zuban research. And I really felt like, man, I really cannot sit on stage and say I'm Suzette Ross. It's impossible. And I still don't have a very good articulation of one. But it is very, very deeply related to the politics of representation, and also to where do I feel as a performer, where do I stand. And I have to admit, I don't have a clear articulate answer. The reason I chose the story that I did, because I find it easier and far more truthful to lead from my life. That doesn't mean that my life stories are enough. But it's just that if I do find a starting point in my own experience, I find it extremely helpful. In this particular story, I've had to change actually very little, which can be read as a fortunate thing for the play, but actually quite an unfortunate thing for my life, I have to say, which only I realized in the process of doing the piece. So, I mean, yeah, that's it.
Okay, there is a question which again relates to both of you. There are two questions actually, similar mirror images or an extension one of the other. So the first of these is the politics of appropriation and the process of making theatre. With the idea that the personal is political, there are certain personal narratives which come out, but many narratives from marginalized communities do not have that sort of capital of various forms to make theatre about their personals, which would get more diverse stories and narratives. So how can we navigate this? And the questioner says that they feel that this comes from a certain kind of universalization of women's experiences as certain women's experiences as all women's experiences, especially in feminist theatre. So how do we get around the sensitivity of the issues we are portraying? And then there's a follow-up question, which is that one of the central issues in your work seems to be creating a certain kind of discomfort in the audience. So what was the most interesting question or discussion that came up for you about this? And that was raised by anyone in the audience at one of your performances. This actually wasn't the related question, I'm sorry. But anyway, there are two questions. So you want to answer it? Please go ahead. Yeah, I'm sorry. There's an extension to that question, which I thought was related and I left out. Sorry. That is, in performing pieces that are already sensitive, what level of extra sensitivity is required? So what are the precautionary sensitive areas you think of while preparing such performances? You thinking, both of you?
Mallika, why don't you go first? There's something up with my camera for some reason. So you go first.
Okay, there's many questions. So you just tell me
Mallika, let me repeat the question for you in brief. The question is about the appropriation of voices in this kind of theatre and about using a certain kind of universal woman's voice, particularly in feminist theatre, which leaves out marginalized voices and so on. So how do you work around that, and how do you work around the sensitivities of these kinds of issues when you're preparing your performances?
I mean, look, I think appropriation works both ways. I think it can be called appropriation, of course, also if it's funny this question has come up because we had a long discussion in KMC about this when we were at KMC, where they said, so then can we not, so which stories do you pick up? Like, who decides which stories you pick up? My feeling, my understanding has been that firstly, I don't think my body and my voice needs to be or can be the vehicle of each and every story. This does not mean that I do not engage with more stories than just mine. But I have to find a way to make space, which means I have to also know when I step away and give space to another body to occupy the stage and tell a certain story. And I think I really think I'm in the place where I'm also finding this, how to kind of bring out more narrative. Just to clarify, I'm extremely clear that I don't represent all women. I represent me. And in that, some people who are listening to what I have to say find some resonance, many don't. I'm aware of this, and I don't think I will ever claim to speak for all or to all. To some extent, I believe that actually no one piece of work can do that. And yet, pieces of work can do it, which is what I found interesting in the showcase. When you looked at your Zuban showcase, when actually you looked at the lineup, any person who was there for the 2 days got a very diverse set of stories. And my story was one of them. And I thought that was a very interesting way to look to access stories, which is why I suppose so many stories were kind of asked to be brought forward. So I think it's really that. I think I'm searching for when I use my voice and when I step away.
Okay, Shabari, do you want to answer? Otherwise, I've got two other key questions actually, which are for both of you, and I think it'd be great if we could quickly look at those. And one really important one is how do you imagine justice outside the legal system? What would be the vocabulary of this kind of justice? Is it even possible to imagine justice outside the legal system? What did you think? What do you think?
My camera has, for some reason, died. So if it's okay for me to just speak like this, then I can go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Of course, I think there is definitely scope to imagine justice outside the legal system, and many times the legal recourse is the last kind of option, right, that people often take, that you try to kind of figure stuff out in other ways. And I feel like theater is definitely a space that allows for conversations about social justice and brings up questions about how are we implicated in this, how do we, and what power do we have as a society, as people, as citizens, as civil society, to impact change and to make change happen. So I feel like actually theater is it doesn't deliver justice in the same way that a legal system might. But I think it definitely opens up opportunities for conversations around justice that might lead to other understandings of what justice could be, and that might just be about recognizing our own roles in this complex system of both impunity and complicity. And I think both of those go very closely together. And I think I think theater actually provides the opportunity to negotiate and engage with those other options.
Mallika, to some extent, you've already addressed a bit of this question when you talked about the importance of the legal, but if you go a bit beyond that, how do you imagine justice outside the legal?
I suppose if I think about myself and I think about all the things that I feel really triggered or angry about, or all the injustices that have happened to me, and I wonder, I don't personally, I'm not taking legal recourse for it, and I don't think I will also, and that's because of many reasons. And I feel like maybe some sort of acknowledgement of the violence causes a lot of closure for a lot of people, and that gives a sense of peace. And I think justice perhaps is also a place of feeling not triggered, feeling that, it's almost like you feel like something dropped, that you can sit and breathe. And I think that perhaps is also a place of how the body might feel like when justice has happened. So many times you say, breathe.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we've dealt with most of the questions. If you don't mind, there was one question for me, and which I'm going to respond to. And in the response, I will also just talk a little bit about this question that Mallika and Shabari have just responded to on what is justice and how can you imagine a justice outside the legal. So the question for me was, how has the graph of sexual violence changed? And I think it's not an easy question to answer, because it's not the graph of sexual violence that has changed, because sexual violence is sexual violence regardless. Some of it is more violent, some may be less violent, but how it's experienced by the victim or the survivor, I think that is what needs to be our focus. But I think that in our understanding, by our I mean in the understanding of, let's say, in the feminist understanding, within quotes, if one can even talk about that kind of thing, our understanding of how to address the subject, how to deal with it, how to work with survivors, how to work with the law, that has certainly changed over the years. And just to give you some very basic kind of examples, in the early days when women's groups started to address the question of sexual violence, we, I think, and I include myself in this, had also internalized to a large extent the victim kind of syndrome. So it was unthinkable for us to hear somebody say, it's not the worst thing that could happen to me and I can survive it. At least I'm alive, or something like that. Or the notion of zinda lash was something that, even though we never used that word, but I think we took it in as a given. So similarly, we have grown in our understanding of the idea of, I don't know how, it's difficult to say. Okay, let's say today we are talking about complex things like consent, and understanding it in many different ways from how we did then. Today, we are talking about consent not as the ability to say no, or not saying a strong no, but actually, why should it be why should it not be that if you want to, you say yes, otherwise, why should the onus be on you to say no? In many ways today, we are also understanding that the focus has to move from the survivor to the perpetrator, because in focusing so much on the survivor, we have let the perpetrator get away, and the cruelty and aggression of the perpetrator never gets talked about. It's the ways, and I think these learnings have come not only from just working on campaigns of with women's groups, but have come from many other groups. Today we have a much better understanding of the intersections of caste and the kind of violence, gendered violence, and so on, which we did not have in the early days of the campaign. So in many ways, that graph, I think, has changed. It's become much more complex and so on. And then to come back to the issue of can we find justice outside the legal? I think yes and no, because justice isn't only the thing out there which the law delivers, but is what is deeply felt, as both Mallika and Shabari pointed out, by the survivor and by those who are close to the survivor. And we have seen many models in the world where people have tried to combine truth, reconciliation, forgiveness, etc. And very often survivors have accepted those, but at other moments they've rejected those because they've said this doesn't give us a sense of justice. So, but sometimes justice can be just in an acknowledgement that a wrong has been done to you, an acknowledgement that your body has been violated, an acknowledgement that you need to have something in your life to be able to rebuild your life again. And that doesn't have to be in the domain of the legal. But our states and our judicial systems are deeply fearful of doing that, because if they acknowledge that, they have to acknowledge that it's happening every day in women's lives, within homes and outside, and that's going to be a really scary acknowledgement. Anyway, I didn't mean to hold forth. Sorry, but I shouldn't have taken up the time. I'm the moderator. I just want to thank Mallika Shabari for being pretty amazing. There's lots of issues we have not managed to address, but as I'm given to saying, any conversation that feels incomplete is a conversation that has been a good one, because there's so much to say. And thank you, all of you, for attending this and listening, and for your fantastic questions. I'll turn you over to Karuna now, who will close the session.
Thank you, everyone, for the discussion. It's definitely left us with a lot to think about. The recording of this webinar will be up on our YouTube channel. And if you want to view previous webinars that we've done in our series, Through Her Lens, Reframing the Domestic and a Crisis of Care, Feminist Perspectives on the COVID-19 Pandemic and Lockdown on India, you can go to our YouTube page, which will be inserted in the chat box below. Please make sure you're following us on social media to stay up to date with any other events or webinars we might be holding in the future. Have a good day and a great weekend ahead. Thanks once again.